The Shadow of Empires. In the heart of a quiet German village, 1919, a young boy named Hans knelt beside his father's workbench, watching the older man carve a wooden toy soldier. The air smelled of sawdust and the faint tang of coal smoke drifting from the nearby train station. Outside, the world was broken. The Great War had ended, but its scars ran deep streets filled with the hollow-eyed, the maimed, and the hungry. Hans's father, once a proud infantryman, now limped from a shrapnel wound, his hands trembling as he worked. "They took everything," he muttered, not looking at his son. "The war, the treaty, the pride of our people, they stripped it all away." Hans didn't understand then, but those words would echo through his life, a whisper of the storm that was coming. Europe in 1919 was a continent on its knees. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the glittering Hall of Mirrors, was meant to forge peace, but instead sowed seeds of resentment. Germany, blamed for the war, was shackled with reparations, $33 billion, a sum that could bankrupt empires. Its territories were carved up, its military gutted, its pride humiliated. In the cafes of Berlin, men spoke in hushed tones of betrayal, their voices drowned by the clatter of empty plates. Across the continent, borders shifted like sand. The Austro-Hungarian Empire crumbled into fragments. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. New nations born in the shadow of old grudges. In Russia, the Bolsheviks tightened their grip, their red banners promising revolution while their boots crushed dissent. Europe was not at peace. It was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. This is the story of how that spark became a fire, a conflagration that consumed millions and reshaped the world. It is a tale of ambition, betrayal, ideology, and survival of a Europe torn apart by its own history and rebuilt in ways few could have imagined. At its heart is the question, how did the world's greatest powers, bound by culture and conquest, descend into a war so brutal it still haunts us? To answer, we must step back, not to the battlefields of 1939, but to the decades before, when the roots of conflict took hold in the soil of empires, revolutions, and broken promises. The Treaty of Versailles was more than a document. It was a wound. Signed on June 28, 1919, it aimed to end the Great War, the war to end all wars. But peace built on blame is no peace at all. Germany was forced to accept guilt for the war, a clause known as Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It was a bitter pill. The German people, already reeling from 4 years of slaughter, saw their nation stripped of 13% of its territory, 10% of its population, and all its colonies. The Rhineland was demilitarized, its coal-rich Saar region handed to France for 15 years. The German army, once a symbol of national pride, was capped at 100,000 men, forbidden from tanks, submarines, or an air force. Reparations loomed like a guillotine, demanding payments that would cripple the economy for generations. In the streets of Munich, veterans like Hans's father felt the sting of defeat not just in their bodies, but in their souls. Hyperinflation was already creeping in, a silent thief. By 1923, a loaf of bread would cost billions of marks, wheelbarrows replacing wallets. Families burned furniture to stay warm, their savings reduced to kindling. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile new democracy, staggered under the weight of these burdens. Political factions, communists, socialists, nationalists, clashed in beer halls and back alleys, their fists and banners painting the cities red and brown. The people craved stability, a return to dignity. They found neither. Across Europe, the treaty's ripples spread. France, scarred by the trenches, demanded security, fortifying its borders with the Maginot Line. Britain, wary of entanglement, retreated into cautious diplomacy. In Italy, a former socialist named Benito Mussolini marched on Rome in 1922, promising to restore the glory of a new Roman Empire. His black-shirted fascists offered order in a nation fractured by poverty and unrest. In Russia, Lenin's Bolsheviks consolidated power, their revolution a beacon for some and a warning for others. The old monarchy's Habsburgs, Hohenzollerns, Romanovs, were gone or fading, replaced by ideologies that burned with certainty: communism, fascism, nationalism. To understand the storm that would come, we must look east, to Russia, where the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 set the stage for a new kind of war. The Romanovs, Russia's imperial family, were executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg, their bodies burned and buried in secret. Lenin's vision of a classless society spread like wildfire, promising workers and peasants a world free from oppression. But the reality was bloodier. The Russian Civil War, raging from 1917 to 1922, pitted Reds against Whites, Communists against monarchists, leaving millions dead from battle, famine, and disease. By 1922, the Soviet Union emerged, a vast experiment in state-controlled equality that sent shockwaves through Europe. The Bolsheviks didn't stop at their borders. They saw Europe as ripe for revolution. In Germany, the Spartacist uprising of 1919, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, aimed to topple the Weimar Republic and install a communist state. It failed. Crushed by government troops and the Freikorps, paramilitary groups of ex-soldiers who despised both communism and the treaty that had humiliated them. In Hungary, Béla Kun's short-lived Soviet Republic in 1919 met a similar fate, collapsing under external pressure and internal chaos. But the fear of the Red Menace lingered, a specter haunting Europe's elites. In drawing rooms and parliaments, the wealthy whispered of Bolshevik plots, of factories seized and churches burned. The stage was set for a counterforce, one that would promise order and strength in the face of chaos. In a smoky beer hall in Munich, 1920, a young Austrian named Adolf Hitler stepped onto a makeshift stage. He was 31, a failed artist turned war veteran, his voice sharp with conviction. The crowd, a mix of workers, soldiers, and disillusioned intellectuals, leaned in as he spoke of Germany's betrayal, of the stab in the back by politicians and profiteers who had surrendered in 1918. He blamed the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar government, and a shadowy enemy, the Jews. To Hitler, they were the architects of Germany's ruin, a scapegoat for every ill economic collapse, moral decay, communist agitation. His words were not new. Anti-Semitism had simmered in Europe for centuries, from medieval pogroms to modern conspiracy theories. But Hitler's rhetoric was electric, weaving old prejudices into a narrative of national salvation. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi for short, was a fledgling movement then, one of many vying for power in a fractured Germany. But Hitler was different. He wasn't just a speaker. He was a storyteller, crafting a myth of a glorious past and a promised future. By 1923, the Nazis attempted their first grab for power, the Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup that landed Hitler in prison. There, he wrote, Mein Kampf, a rambling manifesto that outlined his vision, a Germany reborn, free of Jewish influence, united under a single leader. The book sold poorly at first, but its ideas took root in a nation desperate for answers. While Germany simmered, Europe was a mosaic of competing visions. In France, the Third Republic grappled with political instability, its coalition governments collapsing like houses of cards. Britain, insulated by its empire, focused on trade and naval power, wary of the growing tensions on the continent. In Spain, a military coup in 1923 brought General Miguel Primo de Rivera to power, a precursor to the civil war that would erupt a decade later. In Poland, reborn after a century of partition, national pride clashed with ethnic tensions, its borders uneasy with Germany and the Soviet Union as neighbors. The 1920s were a deceptive calm, a decade of jazz and Art Deco masking deeper fractures. The League of Nations, created to prevent another war, was toothless, undermined by the absence of the United States and the Soviet Union. Economic recovery was uneven. While Paris sparkled with cafes and Berlin buzzed with cabarets, rural areas languished, and unemployment festered. The seeds of conflict were already sown: nationalism, economic despair, ideological extremism. All it would take was a crisis to bring them to bloom. That crisis came in 1929, when the Wall Street stock market collapsed, sending shockwaves across the Atlantic. Europe's economies, already fragile, buckled. Germany, dependent on American loans to pay reparations, was hit hardest. By 1932, unemployment soared to 30%, with 6 million Germans out of work. Soup kitchens stretched across cities, and families like Hans's sold heirlooms to survive. The Weimar Republic, already despised for its association with Versailles, seemed incapable of response. Political violence surged. Communist and Nazi militias clashed in the streets, their flags a grim prophecy of the divide to come. In this chaos, Hitler's message gained traction. The Nazis, once a fringe group, won 107 seats in the Reichstag in 1930, then 230 in 1932. Their rallies, with torchlit processions and swastika banners, offered spectacle and purpose. To a carpenter like Hans's father, who had lost his savings and his faith in the government, the Nazis promised restoration. A return to the Germany of old, strong and proud. By January 1933, Hitler was chancellor, appointed not by a coup, but by the very democracy he vowed to destroy. Hitler's rise was not inevitable, but it was no accident. It was the product of a continent fractured by war, humiliated by treaties, and destabilized by economic collapse. Europe in the early 1930s was a place of extremes, where ideologies clashed like armies. Communism promised equality, but delivered purges. Fascism promised strength, but demanded loyalty. Ordinary people, caught in the middle, sought leaders who could shield them from the storm. As Hans grew up, now a teenager in a brown uniform, he marched in Nazi youth rallies, his chest swelling with the songs of a new Germany. His father, once skeptical, now hung a swastika flag outside their home. They didn't see the darkness ahead, the concentration camps, the invasions, the millions who would perish. They saw only a promise of order in a world that had offered them none. This was the Europe of 1933, a continent on the edge, its people searching for salvation in the shadow of empires. The story was only beginning, and the fire that would consume it was already lit. The swastika flags fluttered in the Munich breeze, their red and black stark against the gray stone of the city's old buildings. It was 1933, and Hans, now 16, stood shoulder to shoulder with other boys in the Hitler Youth, their voices rising in unison, singing of blood and soil. His father, once a broken man, now stood taller, his eyes gleaming with a hope he hadn't felt since the Kaiser's days. The radio blared Hitler's speeches, promising jobs, pride, and a Germany reborn. The streets, once filled with the despair of hyperinflation, buzzed with purpose. Factories hummed again, building roads, cars, and tanks. To Hans, it felt like a miracle. But miracles in those days came at a price. Europe was shifting, its fault lines deepening. Hitler's rise to chancellor was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one far darker. Across the continent, leaders watched with unease or admiration as Germany rearmed, defying the Treaty of Versailles. In Italy, Mussolini's fascism had already taken root, his regime a blueprint of parades and promises. In Spain, the seeds of civil war sprouted, a brutal preview of the ideological battles to come. And in the East, Stalin's Soviet Union tightened its iron grip, its purges silencing dissent, while its factories churned out weapons for a war no one yet named. The Nazi machine. Hitler's Germany moved with terrifying speed. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave him the excuse to suspend civil liberties, banning communist and socialist parties, silencing newspapers, and filling prisons with critics. By March, the Enabling Act made him a dictator in all but name, the Weimar Republic, a fading memory. Propaganda flooded the airwaves, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, whose films and posters painted Hitler as a savior, a modern Charlemagne. The swastika became a symbol not just of a party, but of a nation reborn, or so it seemed. For people like Hans's family, the changes were tangible. The economy, gutted by the Great Depression, began to recover. The Nazis launched public works programs, autobahns stretching across the countryside, factories producing Volkswagens for the people's car. Unemployment plummeted, and bread returned to tables. But beneath the surface, the cost was clear. Jewish shops were boycotted, their windows smeared with stars and slurs. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship, banning them from public life, from marrying non-Jews, from existing as equals. Hans saw his Jewish classmate Jakob disappear from school one day, his desk empty, his family's shop shuttered. "They left for America," a teacher said. But Hans heard whispers of worse. The Nazis didn't just reshape Germany. They redefined it. Schools taught racial science, claiming Aryans were a master race, destined to rule. Children like Hans memorized slogans, saluted flags, and learned to see enemies everywhere. Jews, communists, foreigners. The Hitler Youth wasn't just a club, it was a crucible, forging boys into soldiers. Hans learned to march, to shoot, to believe. His father, now a foreman at a local factory, joined the Nazi Party, not out of zeal, but necessity. "It's the way things are now," he told his son, his voice heavy with resignation. Europe's uneasy watch. Beyond Germany's borders, the world took notice. In France, politicians debated whether Hitler was a passing threat or a permanent one. The Maginot Line, a string of concrete fortresses along the German border, was France's answer, a symbol of defense, but also of fear. Britain, under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, pursued appeasement, believing concessions could tame Hitler's ambitions. In 1935, when Germany reintroduced conscription, violating Versailles, the League of Nations issued a feeble protest. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia that same year, the League's sanctions were toothless, its authority crumbling. In Spain, the fractures of Europe erupted into war. By 1936, the Spanish Civil War pitted General Francisco Franco's nationalists against a fragile Republican government. It was more than a local conflict. It was a testing ground. Germany and Italy sent planes, tanks, and troops to support Franco, their Condor Legion bombing cities like Guernica into rubble. The Soviet Union backed the Republicans, sending advisors and weapons, while volunteers from across Europe, writers, workers, idealists, joined the international brigades. George Orwell, wounded in Catalonia, would later write of the chaos and betrayal he witnessed, a microcosm of the ideological wars brewing. For Hans, reading about Spain in Nazi newspapers, it was a distant drama, proof of Germany's strength. For others, it was a warning. The eastward gaze. Hitler's ambitions stretched beyond Germany's borders. In Mein Kampf, he had written of Lebensraum living space in the east, where Slavic lands would feed and fuel a German empire. Poland, with its vast plains and uneasy borders, was a target. So was the Soviet Union, which Hitler saw as both a threat and a prize, its resources vast, its communist ideology anathema. In 1936, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, a symbolic alliance against communism, later joined by Italy. The Axis was forming, a coalition of nations united by ambition and resentment. Stalin, in Moscow, was no passive observer. His purges, peaking in 1937-1938, eliminated rivals, generals, and intellectuals, hundreds of thousands executed or sent to gulags. The Red Army, once a formidable force, was hollowed out, its officers replaced by loyal but inexperienced men. Yet Stalin's factories produced tanks and planes at a staggering pace, preparing for a war he knew was coming. His spies reported on Hitler's rearmament, on the growing strength of the Wehrmacht. Europe was dividing into camps, and neutrality was becoming impossible. The Anschluss and beyond. In 1938, the storm gathered pace. Hitler turned his eyes to Austria, his homeland, where a weak government struggled under economic strain. On March 12th, German troops crossed the border in the Anschluss, annexing Austria into the Third Reich. Crowds in Vienna cheered, swastikas blooming like flowers. For many Austrians, it was a homecoming. For others, like Vienna's Jewish community, it was the beginning of terror. Hans, now 21, saw newsreels of the annexation, his heart swelling with pride. Germany was growing, reclaiming its place in the world. The next target was Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a border region with a large German-speaking population. Hitler claimed they were oppressed, demanding their return to Germany. At the Munich Conference in September 1938, Britain's Neville Chamberlain and France's Édouard Daladier agreed to let Hitler take the Sudetenland, hoping to avoid war. "Peace for our time," Chamberlain declared, waving a piece of paper signed by Hitler. It was a delusion. By March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, its tanks rolling into Prague without resistance. The world watched, stunned but immobile. Poland was next. Hitler demanded the port city of Danzig and a corridor through Polish territory. Britain and France, finally shaken from their appeasement, pledged to defend Poland. But Hitler had a plan. In August 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. A shocking alliance between sworn enemies. Secretly, they agreed to divide Eastern Europe, with Poland split between them. For Hans, now a soldier in the Wehrmacht, the news was confusing but exhilarating. Germany was unstoppable, its enemies outmaneuvered. The fire ignites. On September 1st, 1939, the world changed. German tanks roared across the Polish border, their engines drowning out the cries of a nation. The Luftwaffe bombed Warsaw, Krakow, and small villages alike, their Stuka dive bombers screaming terror from the skies. Hans was there, a young infantryman, his boots sinking into Polish mud, his rifle heavy in his hands. He had been told this was liberation, a reclaiming of German land. But as he passed burning farms and fleeing families, doubt crept in, a whisper he couldn't shake. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. In Poland, the German Blitzkrieg Lightning war overwhelmed defenses, its tanks and planes moving with precision honed in Spain. By late September, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling its pact with Hitler. Poland was carved up, its people caught in a vice. For Hans, it was victory. For millions, it was catastrophe. The war machine rolls. The fall of 1939 was only the beginning. In 1940, Germany turned west. Denmark and Norway fell in April, their defenses no match for German speed. In May, the Wehrmacht invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, bypassing the Maginot Line through the Ardennes forest. France, once a great power, collapsed in 6 weeks, its army shattered, its government fleeing to Vichy. Paris, the city of light, fell under the swastika. Hans, now a corporal, marched through French villages, his comrades singing, their victory seeming invincible. But victory masked horrors. In Poland, the Nazis had already begun their campaign of extermination. Jewish communities were herded into ghettos, their homes confiscated, their lives reduced to survival. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the army, executing thousands Jews, intellectuals, resistance fighters. Hans heard rumors, stories of mass graves in the East, but dismissed them as propaganda. He had been taught to trust, to obey, to believe in the cause. In Britain, the war took a different form. After the evacuation of Dunkirk, where 338,000 Allied troops escaped German encirclement, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. His voice, defiant over the radio, rallied a nation under siege. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940, as the Luftwaffe bombed London, Coventry, and other cities, aiming to break British resolve. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered but relentless, fought back, their Spitfires and Hurricanes dancing in the skies. Hitler's planned invasion, Operation Sea Lion, faltered, and Britain held. The Eastern Front opens. The true turning point came in June 1941, when Hitler betrayed Stalin. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, sent 3 million German troops into the Soviet Union. Hans was among them, his unit pushing through Ukraine toward Moscow. The summer was hot, the roads dusty, the Soviet resistance fierce but disorganized. Villages burned, prisoners were shot, and the vastness of the East swallowed men whole. Hans saw things he couldn't unsee. Bodies in ditches, children starving, partisans hanged from trees. The war was no longer a parade. It was a machine, grinding lives into dust. The Soviets, caught off guard, reeled. Stalin's purges had weakened the Red Army, but its sheer size and the Russian winter were weapons of their own. By December 1941, as German troops neared Moscow, snow fell, and temperatures plunged to 40°C. Hans's fingers froze to his rifle. His comrades died of frostbite. Their tanks stalled in the ice. The Soviets counterattacked, pushing the Germans back. For the first time, Hans felt fear, not of the enemy, but of the war itself. The Holocaust begins. While Hans fought in the East, a darker plan unfolded. The Nazis called it the final solution, a systematic genocide to eradicate Europe's Jews. In 1941, death camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were established. Their gas chambers and crematoria designed for mass murder. Millions were deported from across Europe, Poland, France, Hungary, the Netherlands packed into cattle cars, their fates sealed. The world would later learn the scale. 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others, murdered in the Holocaust. Hans didn't know the full truth, but he saw enough. In a Ukrainian village, he witnessed an Einsatzgruppen execution. Men and women lined up before a pit, their screams cut short by gunfire. He told himself it was war, that orders were orders. But at night, alone in his tent, Jakob's face came to him, the boy from school, the empty desk. Where was he now? The tide turns. By 1942, the war's momentum shifted. In North Africa, British forces under Bernard Montgomery defeated Germany's Africa Corps at El Alamein. In the Pacific, the United States, now in the war after Pearl Harbor, began its counteroffensive against Japan. In the Soviet Union, the Battle of Stalingrad became the bloodiest of the war, a 6-month siege that trapped Germany's 6th Army in a frozen hell. Hans wasn't there, but he heard the story soldiers eating rats, surrendering in droves, their dreams of victory buried in snow. In February 1943, the 6th Army surrendered, a turning point. The Soviets pushed west, their T-34 tanks outmatching German panzers. In the west, Allied bombing raids pounded German cities, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, reducing them to rubble. Hans, reassigned to a defensive unit in Poland, saw the skies darken with Allied planes, their bombs shaking the earth. The war was no longer about conquest, it was about survival. The home front. In Germany, life grew grimmer. Food was rationed, cities burned, and propaganda couldn't hide the losses. Hans's father, now too old to fight, worked in a munitions factory, his hands blistered from 12-hour shifts. His mother hid her fear behind a forced smile, knitting socks for soldiers she knew might never return. In Berlin, resistance groups like the White Rose distributed leaflets, calling for defiance, but they were crushed, their leaders executed. The Gestapo was everywhere, fear silencing dissent. Across Europe, resistance grew. In France, the Maquis sabotaged railways and ambushed German convoys. In Poland, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 saw Jewish fighters defy the Nazis, a doomed but defiant stand. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans waged guerrilla war, tying down German divisions. These were not just battles, they were acts of hope, proof that the human spirit could endure. The end approaches. By June 1944, the Allies were ready. On D-Day, June 6th, 170,000 troops landed on Normandy's beaches, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Hans, stationed in eastern Poland, heard of it on the radio, a crackling report of the invasion. The Western Front was open, and Germany was caught in a vice allies from the west, Soviets from the east. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt, but its cost was staggering. In the east, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, destroying entire German armies. Hans's unit was overrun, and he became a prisoner, marched to a Soviet camp. His war was over, but the nightmares were just beginning. In Germany, Hitler's regime grew desperate. The July 20th plot, an attempt to assassinate him, failed, leading to brutal reprisals. The Volkssturm, a militia of boys and old men, was called up, a last gasp of a dying regime. The fall of Berlin. In April 1945, the end came. Soviet troops encircled Berlin, their artillery pounding the city into ruins. Hitler, hiding in his bunker, refused to surrender, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. On April 30th, as the Red Army closed in, he took his own life. Days later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Hans, in a Siberian prison camp, heard the news months later. He felt no relief, only emptiness. His country was shattered, its cities rubble, its people starving. The swastika flags were gone, replaced by the flags of occupiers American, British, French, Soviet. Germany was divided, its future uncertain. The reckoning. The war's end was not the end of the story. In Nuremberg, surviving Nazi leaders faced trial. Their crimes laid bare genocide, aggression, atrocities on a scale the world struggled to comprehend. The Holocaust's horrors, revealed in photographs and survivor testimonies, shocked even those who had fought the war. 6 million Jews, countless others, gone. Hans, released in 1947, returned to a Germany he barely recognized. His father was dead, killed in a bombing raid. His mother lived in a refugee camp, her eyes hollow. Across Europe, the reckoning continued. Poland, liberated from the Nazis, fell under Soviet control, its freedom traded for a new kind of oppression. France and Britain, exhausted, faced the decline of their empires. The Cold War began, dividing Europe into East and West, a new Iron Curtain replacing the old battle lines. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe, but the scars remained. Cities leveled, families broken, trust eroded. A new Europe. Hans settled in West Germany, working as a mechanic. His Hitler Youth days a secret he buried deep. He married, had children, and tried to forget the boy who marched under swastikas. But history doesn't forget. In the 1960s, as Germany prospered, younger generations began to ask questions. Trials continued Eichmann in Jerusalem. Auschwitz, guards in Frankfurt forcing Europe to confront its past. The European Union, born from the ashes of war, aimed to bind nations together, to make war unthinkable. Yet the ghosts lingered. In Poland, memorials rose at Auschwitz, a reminder of the unthinkable. In Spain, Franco's regime endured until 1975, a last echo of fascism. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's legacy cast a long shadow, its collapse in 1991 freeing Eastern Europe but unleashing new tensions. Hans, now an old man, watched the Berlin Wall fall in 1989, a moment of hope tempered by memories of division. The legacy. What does it mean to remember? For Hans, it was a private burden, a life spent reconciling the boy he was with the man he became. For Europe, it was a collective challenge to honor the dead, to learn from the past, to build a future where such horrors could not repeat. The war killed 70 million people, redrew maps, and reshaped the world. It gave birth to the United Nations, to human rights laws, to a determination that never again must mean something. Yet history is not a straight line. In the 21st century, Europe faces new challenges: nationalism, migration, economic divides. The lessons of the 1930s, of how fear and despair can fuel extremism, remain urgent. Hans died in 2005, his story one of millions, a thread in the tapestry of a continent that survived its darkest hour. The final frame. In a quiet German village, 2025, a young girl walks past a memorial, a simple stone etched with names of those lost to the war. She pauses, her phone casting a soft glow as she reads about the past. The world has changed. Technology, borders, dreams. But the stone remains, a reminder that history is not just a story, but a warning. Europe, forged in fire, stands at a crossroads. Will it remember, or will it forget? The answer lies not in the past, but in the choices we make now.